Hello everyone and welcome to the kickoff of CloudCon 2014. My name is Roger, your moderator, and I want to start by acknowledging the sponsors of today's online conference, Voltage Security, VM Turbo, and eNow, all of whom have made it possible for us to bring you today's event, which is presented by cloudcomputingadmin.com, one of the TechGenics networks of professional portal sites. All participant lines are muted, but you may use the chat panel to submit any questions or comments you have during today's presentation, and we'll address as many as possible at the end. This first session will conclude in time for those of you who will be joining the next breakout session, and that will begin exactly 5 minutes after this session concludes. Also, please be aware that we're using the Twitter hashtag TGCloudCon, that's hashtag TGCloudCon, to share the links to the remaining breakout sessions. Those links also appear in your email confirmations. Michael Osterman from Osterman Research will get us started today, and then later we'll also be joined by Mark Bauer, Vice President of Product Management and Solutions Architecture at Voltage Security, and a noted expert in data protection solutions with over 20 years of industry experience in information security across the globe. So with that, I will now turn it over to you, Mike.
Well, Roger, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody who's attending this virtual conference today. I think we'll be able to provide you with some very useful information and maybe a way of thinking about the cloud and thinking about encryption in ways maybe you hadn't done before. So just a little bit about Osterman Research so you know our perspective on all of this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm that really is very focused on the messaging, web, and collaboration industries. Our focus really is on any technology that helps individuals communicate or collaborate in a workplace context. Our practice areas obviously include things like encryption in the cloud, but then everything around that, archiving, security, content management, and so forth. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be presenting a bit of that here today. And we talk really to decision makers and influencers to find out what's going on in the industry, the problems that organizations are experiencing, the kinds of things that organizations would like to do to be able to overcome their problems and so forth. The company was founded back in 2001, and we're based near Seattle, Washington. So first and foremost, we hear a lot about the cloud. It's difficult to open up any sort of a trade publication and not find some discussion about the cloud, how organizations are moving email or CRM or some business application to the cloud. And so we did a survey recently. And one of the questions we asked was, and this was IT decision makers that we spoke to, usually, or in most cases in mid-sized and large organizations. And we asked, okay, how open is your management, overall business and IT management, to the notion of moving key applications to the cloud, whether it's encryption or archiving or email, whatever it might be. And what we found is that a relatively small proportion of organizations, about 1 out of 5, are really not very open to the notion of moving to the cloud. They, as we'll discuss here in a bit, they may be concerned about security or protection of privacy and so forth. But we do find that most organizations are at least somewhat open to the cloud, and some are very open. We've looked at the success of products like Microsoft Office 365 or Google Mail or Salesforce.com, and we find that a large number of organizations really are very open to moving to the cloud. And as you can see here, it's about half of organizations that really are really quite open. So obviously the prospects of the cloud are very good, and we expect that over time more of these bars will shift to the right as decision makers become more comfortable with the cloud, as they decide there are cost benefits and other types of benefits that they can derive from going that way. So there really are several concerns, but they really tend to focus on 3 areas. For example, we asked organizations in the survey, why aren't you using cloud-based email if you're not doing so? Well, certainly it's a desire to maintain control of the email environment. Email, as we'll be discussing here in a bit, is the #1 application that most organizations employ. So it's critical for them to maintain control, whether that's in the cloud or on premises. Also, a lot of decision makers believe that in-house management of email is more flexible than outsourcing. And they're also concerned about data security when a third party is involved. We've heard about data leaks and data breaches and so forth, and there's always that level of concern that organizations have when they move something as critical as email to the cloud. We also asked about email security and basically came to the same conclusions. There's a desire to maintain control of the email environment as a driver for not going with an email security-based solution in the cloud. A lot of organizations already have major investments. They have legacy email security applications that they're maintaining, and so they don't perceive maybe there's a need to go to the cloud. And they also perceive that in-house management is more flexible. And I won't belabor the point here with regard to email archiving and web-based security, but we're seeing basically the same themes over and over. Organizations are concerned about their data security anytime a third party is involved. Email is fraught with risk when it comes to phishing and malware incursions, and the stories we've heard about Target and Home Depot and Neiman Marcus and so forth as it relates to the ability for cyber criminals to exfiltrate data out of an organization is really a top-of-mind concern for a lot of organizations, and they don't want to add the additional problem, if you will, of going to the cloud, where they may have an untrusted provider that is managing their data, storing it in some remote data center, and so forth. So the concerns about security and privacy laws apply certainly to email archiving, where you're storing a large amount of valuable information in a third-party data center, and similar types of concerns with regard to web security. And again, the flexibility is an issue here as well. So the objections to the cloud really tend to focus on a few key themes. Certainly security, and we've been tracking this industry for many, many years, and even before Osterman Research, I was looking at the hosted email market, and we found a lot of these same themes. Concern over security, there's a perception by some, certainly a minority of organizations, that there's a lack of control in the cloud. They want to maintain that flexibility and being able to have an on-premises solution or go to the cloud, basically to have both capabilities, and then data privacy. Certainly a critical issue today, and probably becoming a more top-of-mind issue as we move forward because of the very high-profile breaches that we've seen. So what's not as important? Well, certainly the cost of cloud services. That really doesn't come up very much. A lot of organizations are not failing to go to the cloud because they're concerned about cost, and a lot of organizations are not going to the cloud because they feel it's a dramatically cheaper way to go. Now, if you go to the cloud, it can be less expensive, but that tends not to be a top-of-mind driver for most organizations. And also the migration capabilities. While that's a critical issue, being able to migrate large amounts of data to a cloud provider, that tends not to be the most top-of-mind issue that organizations consider in their deliberations about going to the cloud or not. So certainly it's incumbent upon cloud providers to provide that level of security and control and flexibility and protection of data privacy that organizations are seeking, because those tend to be the hot buttons for most organizations. Now, all of that said, certainly the cloud is going to become more popular for a variety of applications. For example, antivirus and anti-spam, email, archiving, web security, encryption. We see a lot more of these migrating to the cloud. Now, it's important to note that, this is the percentage of end users that are served by cloud delivery. A couple of issues here. One, we're still going to see most deployments being of on-premises solutions, although more and more of them will go to the cloud over time. But what we're also seeing is that a lot of organizations are going to be having a hybrid model in place. They will have an on-premises solution for email, but they'll also have a cloud-based solution, maybe for employees in satellite offices. They will have on-premises security solutions for doing the really deep inspection of content, but they will also have antivirus and anti-spam in the cloud. So this is, in most cases, not really an either-or scenario. It's really a both scenario, because most organizations, particularly large ones, are going to be employing both delivery models and really extracting the benefits of both. So here's our contact information. If you would like to contact us, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And now I'd like to go into our next session, which is really discussing encryption and why the rise of the cloud means that you absolutely have to protect your emails. So, we hear a lot of discussion about email, that, email is going away, that text messaging or social media or collaboration tools or enterprise social networking of some kind is simply going to displace email. We also hear that younger workers coming into the workforce, they just don't use email anymore. That's for their parents or grandparents, and so they're on social media, they use text messaging, they use Instagram, what have you. So, there's a mindset out there that email is going away and it's just not as relevant anymore, and that you don't really have to worry about it because less and less business communications is going to be transmitted that way. Well, bottom line is that's not really the case. We've been doing surveys of IT as well as end users for a long time, specifically about this question. And we've been asking, is email really going away? Are you using email more today than you were a year ago? How reliant on email are you for, getting your work done? How many minutes per day do you spend in email, and so forth? And what we found in a survey that we ran this month, actually just a few days ago, is that 45% of users employ email more today than they did 12 months ago. We've also found that it's only about 5% of users are using email less today, and the rest are using email about as much as they were a year ago. So, what we're finding is that the preponderance of users are using email either more today or just as much as they were a year ago. And so email really is not going away. And this result is fairly consistent with what we found over the last several years, that email use is either holding steady or is continuing to grow. What we also found in the most recent study is that users spend about 163 minutes per day doing work in their email client or in webmail. And that's not to say that they're just spending that time sending or receiving email, but they're doing that plus managing contacts, managing tasks, using email as sort of a free-form filing system, looking for applications and so forth. And so what we find is that email is the single most used application that employees go to on a regular basis. They spend more time in email than they do in any other application. So email really is a critical issue for organizations to deal with, particularly in the context of encryption. What we also find is that email is really the primary file transport mechanism in most organizations. We find, for example, that if anybody's going to send a file, it's in most cases going to be through email. Yes, there's Dropbox and lots of file sync and share solutions. Organizations have FTP. They have some very good solutions for sharing content, but by and large, email continues to be the primary way that people send files back and forth to one another. We found in a separate survey that 25% of all emails contain some sort of an attachment. So if you look at how email is used, what we find is that the vast majority of the bits that are flowing through most email systems are really the files, the attachments that are attached to emails, not the messages themselves. So we tend to think of email as a communications platform, when in reality it's a file transport platform that also does communications. So bottom line here is email is just not going away. It's here to stay for many years to come. Now, this came from a survey we did in April, and we asked, this was IT decision makers that we asked about the ability of their end user populations to either manually encrypt or have their emails automatically encrypted through some sort of a policy-based encryption solution. And what we find is that today only about 39% of individual users can actually manually encrypt an email, and only 28% are served by some sort of a policy-based encryption solution. So, bottom line here is that most emails are not being sent encrypted, largely because users don't have that easy capability to do that or that automatic capability to do it. We asked organizations also, what do you expect 2 years out? And certainly we find a lot more use of encryption, particularly if policy-based encryption, where it'll automatically scan the content of an email, look for a social security number or something that's in a corporate policy, and then automatically encrypt that email. We're finding some fairly rapid growth there, but also significant growth in the manual encryption capability, where somebody has a button, for example, in Outlook, and they can click the button, automatically encrypt the email, and have it sent out. But what we're finding is that despite the fact that there's a need for the ability to encrypt emails automatically or to do it manually, most organizations today don't have that capability, and only about half will 2 years out. That represents a very serious issue, as we'll go into here in just a couple of minutes. So bottom line here is that email is obviously a critical application for all of us, but it is very problematic. And this came from the survey that we did just a couple of days ago. And what we found is that only 31% of users have their email automatically encrypted based on content. And a little bit different results here from the previous survey. One because of the timing issue. One was done in April. This survey was done in December. And also this survey asked end users, not IT. And we also found that only 37% of users can manually encrypt their emails directly from their email client. We also found that 29% of end users cannot encrypt emails, or they're not even sure whether or not they can encrypt them. So again, a very serious issue, because a lot of sensitive and confidential content is being sent through email systems, and it's simply not being encrypted. That represents a problem for organizations that are trying to use email as a platform for sending sensitive information that they really don't want to have accessed by unauthorized parties. Now, email is obviously not always secure, and users tend to know that. What was interesting in this end user survey we've just completed in December is that we asked end users, do you sometimes avoid sending a message, a file, or other content through email because you're just not sure the content's going to be protected from unauthorized access? And what we found is that for 1 out of 12 users, they frequently don't send email specifically because of that issue. They're sending something that's sensitive or confidential, or that's intended only for one party, and they're just not sure that their email client is going to be able to protect that content, that the email system is going to be able to protect that information from unauthorized access. We found that about a third of end users sometimes don't send emails specifically because of that. So this is a very serious issue. We're finding that email systems then are underutilized simply because of the lack of encryption and the lack of security that organizations are experiencing. And that's a very serious issue. And Mark, I wanted to get your input on this as well. I mean, how serious is this issue, and do you find this as well in talking to customers and prospects and so forth?
Definitely. I think there's a big challenge because of the complexities over traditional approaches that have put people off from attempting to use email encryption. I guess the good news is, as I'll illustrate, that there are some very nice ways to be able to solve these problems so that you can effectively remove that red bar there that you have in your survey. But we find that this is very common, especially now when you start to look at the smartphone adoption. The simple requirement to be able to easily compose a message to anyone and send a secure message on the go is harder than you think with traditional approaches. So I think that compounds the problem, and it'll only get worse until organizations adopt more simple and straightforward approaches.
That's a very good point. And certainly we've done a lot of research around mobile, and more and more content is being accessed and created on mobile devices. So that's going to become a much more serious issue in the future. And as you've noted, I mean, a lot of solutions, a lot of encryption solutions are really not well suited to the mobile experience. When you're trying to do something on a 4-inch screen, that can certainly complicate life when it comes to encryption. So, certainly the whole notion around bring your own device, bring your own cloud, bring your own applications and so forth is making the problem much worse. Certainly BYOD is here to stay. We're in that phase of the adoption cycle for BYOD now that most organizations, most IT organizations, have simply acquiesced. They're not opposing the consumerization of IT anymore, and we're finding, in fact, that some organizations have actually embraced it. They are pushing forward for this consumerization idea that individuals should be allowed to own their own devices, their own tablets, smartphones, laptop computers, what have you, and maybe receive some sort of a stipend from the company. And one of the issues there that a lot of people aren't talking about is that it's actually cheaper for companies to do that. We did a survey some time back, and we asked about the notion of zombie phones, those phones that are assigned to employees who have then left the company. And we found that about 10 to 11% of organizations really weren't sure that they had ever turned off these accounts. So a lot of organizations are paying for a smartphone or tablet or some sort of wireless access for employees who are no longer there. And so a lot of organizations are embracing BYOD specifically to get around that problem, so that when the employee leaves, since they're paying for it, they can cut off the stipend, and it just makes economic sense. So, certainly it's creating problems for organizations, but solving some of them at the same time. Now, one of the problems that BYOD or BYOC, BYOA causes is that IT is losing control about how they manage content on a wide variety of platforms, whether that's the corporate desktop or laptops or some sort of a mobile device, even home computers and personal email accounts. We find these are extensively used for business purposes, and these all create problems with regard to encryption, with regard to content management, with regard to protecting corporate data assets, maintaining data privacy, and so forth. These are very serious issues that organizations are contending with. And while BYOD, is here to stay, it's creating a lot of problems that organizations have to address. And based on the research we've done, many organizations have not yet gotten to the point where they've solved these problems. So, is failure to encrypt an option? Well, it shouldn't be an option, but it really is. It is an option for a lot of organizations. For example, if you don't encrypt content and you're sending sensitive information, maybe it's customer financial information, employees' protected health information, maybe an HR person is sending information about employees' health records to a benefits administrator, things of that nature. If you don't encrypt that content, you can violate data breach laws. 46 U.S. states, for example, have data breach notification requirements that say if you breach sensitive information, and there's a long list of different types of sensitive information you can breach, then you have to notify the affected parties, and that can be a very expensive thing to do. And in most cases, these data breach notification requirements have an exemption for encrypted content. So if somehow an encrypted email gets in the hands of the wrong party, you don't have to notify the affected party because there's the presumption that the unauthorized access won't result in any negative issues, that the bad guy really can't get access to that sensitive information. If you do, however, breach information in the clear, you can have very expensive remediation efforts, contacting the individuals, maybe buying credit reporting services. You have bad press, loss of reputation, and so forth. You can also violate federal regulations, various industry standards. Massachusetts and Nevada, for example, have encryption laws, so now you've got problems at the state level as well. And then you can also lose intellectual property. And there's a lot of information that flows through email that you might not realize is, needs to be encrypted, but it does contain some sort of intellectual property that the organization probably doesn't want to leak out. And it can be something as simple as an embargoed press release that you wouldn't want to have in the hands of the wrong party before a certain date. And that is a very common thing that flows through email, completely unencrypted. So why is encryption not more common? Certainly most organizations have not implemented it. They haven't implemented either policy-based, some sort of an automated encryption solution, but they also haven't really implemented the basic encryption policies that describe what kinds of content should and should not be encrypted. That's really the first place to start that most organizations really haven't started at this point. They haven't specifically identified those types of content that need to be encrypted, those that contain protected health information, consumer financial information, whatever the case may be. They know intellectually that this content should be encrypted, but they haven't really established basic policies that say these are the exact types of content that need to be encrypted before they leave the organization. Part of the problem, too, is that legacy encryption solutions just weren't that easy to use, or maybe they required too much user involvement. Also, a lot of encryption solutions are not designed for mobile users, as Mark noted. And so that whole notion of the legacy of difficult encryption is really a drag on encryption, if you will, for a lot of organizations that have this perception that encryption is difficult to use, it's going to result in messages not going through, and so forth. Mark, wanted to get your input here as well about your thoughts on sort of the legacy of bad encryption in the past.
I think that's been one of the big problems. There were some really seminal papers many years ago written on this topic. The Johnny can't encrypt and Johnny can't encrypt again that really outlined through surveys with users trying to use those older approaches, which were largely oriented to the very technical users, were really complicated and just messy, and most people end up with confusion. And if you have confusion and you have pressure to get something done, then people will simply bypass it. And that's exactly what you've observed, I think, with both the surveys today and your observations here. Again, good news about this. There are ways to overcome those so that it can be literally as almost simple as doing a regular email today, and we'll show exactly how.
Okay, excellent. So what happens if you don't encrypt content? I won't go through all of these examples, but these are recent examples of bad things that have happened. For example, in the case of Anthem Blue Cross, an employee sent unencrypted emails that included very sensitive health-related information and demographic information about members of Blue Cross. The UC Davis Health System, physician's work email account was accessed by some unauthorized party, and an email on that account contained the personal or medical information on over 1,000 patients. So, again, won't go through all of these examples, but these are very serious issues that if you're sending sensitive or confidential information that needs to be encrypted and you don't encrypt it, that can result in a whole cascade of problems. Certainly there's the bad press and the reputation is noted, but then very expensive remediation efforts. And studies have found that when this happens in the retail industry, again, going back to Target, that sales are reduced, that revenue drops. And certainly, if there's a data breach that can occur of any kind, whether it's through some sort of a hacking attempt or simply not encrypting email that needs to be encrypted, there can be a variety of consequences depending upon your industry and the extent of the breach and so forth, and none of those consequences are good. All of them have varying levels of negative impact, and they should be avoided hopefully at all costs. So we also asked in a separate survey about organizations' plans for encryption. And what we found is that encryption is a relatively top-of-mind issue for a lot of IT organizations. What we found is that nearly a third of them are going to purchase either new or replacement solutions for policy-based automatic encrypted email by the end of 2015. We found the same proportion are probably or definitely going to invest or make some additional investments in policy-based encryption by the middle of next year. And we found that nearly that many are going to purchase newer replacement solutions for manually encrypting email by the end of 2015. So, certainly we do see a lot of action with regard to encryption. Organizations are moving that way. They realize the negative impact of not encrypting sensitive or confidential email and so forth. We also found in the survey that more organizations are leaning toward the policy-based encryption model as opposed to manual encryption. There are benefits and advantages to both, but we find more preference for the policy-based encryption model. And as we showed earlier in the presentation, certainly we're seeing more rapid growth in policy-based encryption than we are in manual encryption over the next couple of years. So what should you do? Certainly, any set of recommendations is going to vary based on the size of your organization, the geographic distribution of your employees, the jurisdictions in which you operate and so forth. But certainly we recommend for just about any organization, first and foremost, before you deploy technology, develop an encryption plan. Establish policies about what you're going to encrypt, what you can safely not encrypt, and so forth. And that's absolutely essential. You need to know why you're encrypting and exactly the kinds of content that you will be encrypting. Then you need to identify all of your sensitive information, how your employees are accessing that information, how they're sending it, where it might be located in the organization, identify the risks of not encrypting it while it's in transit and so forth. And certainly there are lots of ways to send sensitive information. Certainly email is the #1 way to do it, but there's also Dropbox, there's FTP, there's a variety of file sharing solutions out there. So you need to identify where this information is and how it's being sent today, and then identify where it needs to be encrypted. Certainly create a business case and a return on investment model for encryption. It's not tough to do because if you ever have one data breach, you've probably more than paid for your encryption solution for many, many years, simply because the cost of a data breach is enormous in some cases, and it can have very long-lasting ramifications. You need to identify what happens if you don't encrypt data. Again, going back to sort of the negative impacts of not encrypting, that's going to help create the business case. You need to train employees about encryption best practices. A lot of employees, they're trying to do the right thing, but they're rushed or they forget policies, what have you. So training is an important aspect of this. Just one simple example. When somebody's forwarding an email, they may not see the sensitive information contained within it, but there may be something buried deep down in something that they're forwarding. So it's important to train employees about that, and also focus maybe more on policy-based encryption, because that will automatically scan emails and look for that kind of content. Then you need to implement policy controls at the gateway and or in the cloud. You might want to use both. You might want to use just one, but doing so at the gateway is an important element in ensuring that information is protected. And then finally, evaluate your deployment options on premises, cloud, or what we think is going to happen in a lot of cases, that hybrid solution, so that you can have both cloud and on-premises models working side by side and in conjunction with one another. Okay, again, here's our contact information, and at this point I'd like to turn it over to Mark Bowers for his presentation.
Excuse me, Mike, but if we could pause, we did get a couple of questions in that I'd like to throw out for either you or Mark to address. Could we take a couple?
Absolutely, happy to do so.
Okay, first one is, what precautions should I take when sending encrypted emails in an era of government access to communications? Yeah, that's actually a pretty good question.
There was an article that came out a couple of months ago that talked about the NSA and the revelations from Edward Snowden and so forth, and it also noted that if you use encryption, there's almost a presumption on the part of some in government that you have something to hide. That probably applies more to sort of rogue individuals and so forth as opposed to companies. But there's always that supposition maybe on the part of some that you're trying to hide something in an encrypted email. And in reality, you are trying to hide something. You're trying to hide information that you don't want the world to see. That said, it's still absolutely important to protect that sensitive content. There are specific statutes that require you to do so, but it's also best practice just to protect the information you have. And so, while there may be, some concern over encrypting content that, others are going to perceive, they're going to perceive that whole notion of encryption as, maybe suspect in some way, you absolutely have to do it.
And we have one more we'll take. This one is, does the use of encryption slow down emails or make them more difficult to access for unsophisticated recipients?
The short answer for me is no, but Mark, I'm going to let you take that.
Thanks. So I think in the past, yes, that might have been the case, but we've seen a lot of innovation in the last 10 years that effectively can make email that's secure yet straightforward, and it's illustrated through the fact that we have customers today with exactly that challenge, where they need to interact with consumers. For instance, it might be a bank that's handling mortgage refinancing with a customer that's on the go. So we can certainly address those types of use cases, and the past problems are certainly behind us these days.
Well, great. Well, and with that, we'll go ahead and now and turn it over to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for that interesting overview, Michael. So first of all, just a little bit about Voltage. Many of you would have heard of us before. We're one of the leaders in the email encryption space, but we go well beyond that to protect any kind of information wherever it goes through industry best practices of data encryption and tokenization, effectively providing easy data protection even for complex use cases. So we ultimately neutralize data from breach risks, we minimize compliance costs, and we mitigate those advanced threats that are compromising many businesses today, as Michael pointed out. And we do this for large enterprises as well as small, with on-premise solutions, cloud solutions, and hybrid, as Michael noted as well. So without further ado, I'm going to jump ahead and talk specifically about encrypting email. So as Michael pointed out, there's many reasons that you need to encrypt email, but it's more than it was 10 years ago, for instance, when we were looking at email of getting email from point A to point B in some kind of secure way for a very small number of users. Today, as a consequence of data breaches and with the concerns over data privacy, and with the adoption of more and more online services, there's a distinct trend towards even more aggressive compliance enforcement and privacy regulations around sending information over open public networks, whether it's things like PCI DSS, SEC regulations, HIPAA, HITECH, and so on in the US, or overseas we see similar regulations in Europe and across Asia. There's also the need to separate access inside organizations in many cases to meet compliance regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley. And the email systems are becoming more increasingly used, as Michael pointed out, and in many cases, sensitive attachments about highly regulated information can find its way into IT systems. And so we need controls over this, but we don't want to get in the way of actually enabling business. And of course, there's also the control aspect. So when you put data up into the cloud, it's more difficult to control it because you've offloaded that responsibility to the provider in some way, shape, or form, whether it's from an operational standpoint or management. And in many cases, there may be regulations that restrict what you as the data owner can do with that information in these uncontrolled or less trusted ecosystems. So the ability to maintain control over data, especially things like data retention periods for electronic discovery and recovery, can be served and enabled by encryption. And of course, when we're sending messages through email, it goes today far beyond just hitting that send button. As soon as that email goes out into the open world, it's possibly fair game if it's not secured. It travels over open, compromisable networks that are vulnerable to malware, attacks, sniffing, and also things like subpoenas from government. So it's the ability to also protect beyond the send, as I outline here, that can also drive the reason to encrypt using more modern contemporary approaches. And last but not least, there's the risk aspect. Malware has become much more sophisticated these days, and we're seeing more and more data being stored on laptops as a consequence of cheap storage that's very efficient and fast. So even in scenarios where we might have things like a laptop that's stolen, but there was actually very sensitive content in somebody's inbox in that, on that laptop, that can result in pretty serious consequences. And of course, when you send a message, it could go to many places. It can go to archives, it can go across networks, it can go to many different recipients, and many of those may be in and out of the cloud. And so there's plenty of risks here that have to be dealt with in a more contemporary ecosystem than we had 10 years ago. So why is it so hard to encrypt email? Because after all, we're trying to get from Alice, the most famous person in cryptography, to Bob, the other most famous person in cryptography, without complexity. And yet the approaches that have largely been used suffer from many different challenges, as I'll outline. The challenge, of course, is that today it's not just about Alice and Bob. You have the internal enterprise, where you've got mobile users, smartphone users that might be managed by MDM systems to control what the behavior of that mobile app does, but the messages flow from those devices into and out of enterprise systems, across networks, into archives. And these days we might have automation. So if I'm an insurance company, I might have a process where I'm onboarding a customer over the phone through a call center, but I want their policy to be automatically emailed to them so that we can close that business while they're there on the phone. We might have applications that generate those messages. Then, of course, we've got outside the business. We've got business partners that exist across the world that we want to interact with, whether that's a manufacturer where we want to send manufacturing specifications. It might be business partners that we're sharing analytic information in order to delve into customer records for business benefit. Of course, we sometimes need to interact with consumers, and these days we've got those app-savvy consumers that are constantly on their smartphones, always expecting that seamless user experience and being able to interact with businesses online through their phones. We also find, of course, the inevitable cloud. We have the recipients that may be in the cloud or parts of the enterprise. And as Michael pointed out, with more and more organizations moving to these types of architectures, we need to address this with new approaches to secure the information without complexity. And last but not least, we also have to deal with the concept of the fact that messages are going to exist across different borders and jurisdictions, languages, and so on. And so an email encryption strategy needs to take into account this ecosystem so that it can address all of these use cases without complexity and without further impacting business execution. So email encryption should be easy. Email encryption should be also a strategic enabler and not a necessary evil. And I think Michael's statistics kind of illustrate that we're still in the latter situation in many cases. But the good news is it doesn't have to be that way. So if you took a viewpoint of what we need from a strategic email encryption platform to enable that vision of being able to secure information and attachments everywhere that it can go, then it needs to be as close to regular email that we're all familiar with today and increasingly using as is possible. We need to be compatible, whether it's sending messages to the cloud, because we might have recipients in Gmail, we might have them in the enterprise, we might have systems that need to inspect content. And the last thing we want to do is have secure email that then compromises the ability to check if we've actually got viruses that might be arriving into our ecosystems, or content that shouldn't actually be ever leaving the business, even if it is encrypted. So we need to work with DLP systems, and then we start to get into things like electronic discovery, how we want to authenticate people, because that might vary by business. And then, of course, we've got to work with mobile device management systems so that we can have a complete picture of risk and control and work with existing IT and policy. And as Michael pointed out, one of the big uses of email today is sharing those attachments. It's very common to find, hey, I'll just send you this PowerPoint. Hey, I'll just send you this spreadsheet. And those files are getting increasingly large. And indeed, many email systems struggle just on their own without encryption with these scenarios. So we have to be able to handle those large files and be able to share them interactively easily. We need to manage policy after send as well, because if I'm sending a message across into a jurisdiction where I have less control, or the message is going to arrive in a cloud system, I need to know that I've done my best from a compliance standpoint and a risk standpoint to avoid some kind of inadvertent breach through either blind subpoena or other kinds of accidents. So we need to control this by policy, and of course we need to enable the business, deliver end-to-end security, create new opportunities to engage through this type of capability. We need to work across all of the different channels to market and internally and externally, and of course we need to keep costs down. And the bottom line is that email encryption should be for everyone, not just for that handful of technical users, which is really where a lot of these solutions have their origins and still have the same challenges. So we need to go beyond those traditional approaches and look at more modern technologies. And the good news is that new techniques have emerged over the last 10 years that have now become adapted and adopted into standards to enable this to be pervasively consumed for millions of users, as we will illustrate. So I'm going to introduce you to this concept of identity-based encryption in a moment and contrast that to traditional approaches, and to show you how this core technology makes email encryption really easy. So if we look back at the traditional approaches of going from Alice to Bob, it should be straightforward. We should be able to hit send secure and be done with it. But unfortunately, traditional approaches, as Michael's pointed out, have been very complicated for users. We've got messy links that often expire with webmail systems, which can complicate that e-discovery and recovery and data retention rule requirements. They often have dedicated staff to manage these complex architectures and have difficulty scaling, and ultimately are confusing, and in many cases messages might not arrive if there's proprietary methods with active code and JavaScript in them that get stamped on by the gateways because they look like malware and viruses. I guess, Michael, a question for you. Is this a reflection of what you also see, this kind of reaction to the traditional approaches in your interviews?
Well, certainly I think there's a need for a lot of education on the part of end users and IT organizations about how encryption is deployed and so forth. We find that it's a top of mind issue, but a lot of organizations still need some better understanding of newer encryption models and really just how easy it can be. I think a lot of people are still stuck in that legacy mindset.
Thanks. Okay, so let's look at that legacy mindset and look at the challenges. So quite often there's been standards around for many years, these kind of legacy PKI models for email encryption. I think many people are familiar with the methods like PGP, SMIME, and so on, which are certainly secure and they do work, but the problem is they're difficult to use. You basically put challenges to end users to do things like manage keys and certificates. And you need to have certificates for everybody that's in the network of recipients before you can even send. And then you start to get into how do you trust those certificates and so on, and you end up with a very complicated problem, which is why, even though these technologies have been around for many years, they're just not pervasively used. And as a consequence of that, they're not always even present in email clients. So if you look at some of the mobile clients, we might have SMIME capabilities in iOS, but we might not have it on Android. And that creates all sorts of incompatibilities and complexities. And to an end user, you shouldn't have to deal with that. And the consequences is difficult to use and also very expensive when you try to use them, especially at scale. So to overcome those problems, vendors came out with these proprietary symmetric key solutions. And the challenge here is that this just shifts the complexity into things like key management or incompatibilities in messages. If you add active code to messages, like I mentioned, the gateways tend to stamp on those and block them. And I'm sure many who've tried this will have experienced that. And there's nothing worse than sending some sensitive, very important, timely content to a recipient and finding that they never received it because some gateway or other actually stopped it. And of course, managing every key for each of these types of messages can get really, really costly at scale. And even if this is hidden behind a cloud, for instance, that complexity is always going to be reflected in the costs for the service. So the other approach people have often tried is using webmail. And of course, that's a potential approach, but it's moving the problem instead of solving it. You move messages to some kind of store, you send a link to the recipients, and of course, because you can't keep everything for long periods of time, you have to expire those messages. And quite often, the user experience is quite limited, especially in mobile devices where you might have very difficult user experiences in the browsers, for instance, because of size, scale, and so forth. So all of these approaches, while they have potential, don't solve the problem and get complex to manage and costly at scale. Well, what about TLS? So that's another email encryption approach that's commonly mentioned, and this is effectively just a method of encrypting point to A to point B, but at an organizational level. And all this does is provide a VPN, essentially, for email between one organization and another. But if I've sent a message that goes to 3 recipients, and one of them is on TLS, well, the contents have gone in the clear to the other 2. So it might not actually solve the problem. It's useful for those scenarios where you've got regular messages going back and forth between very rigid business partners, but it's not going to protect the messages. It's not going to resolve the issues of risk in the inbox or compromise of a cloud mailbox, for example. So useful, but not the answer. So a simpler approach is using this concept of identity-based encryption. What we want to do is send a message from A to B so that the end users don't have to even think about keys and certificates, and so that key management effectively happens automatically and on the fly. So we're not having to keep and manage keys at end users, and ultimately this results in the fact that Alice can send a message to Bob, and Bob can open it, authenticate, read and reply, and that's it. And we've avoided a lot of the complexities of having to manage keys, certificates, and we can start to introduce sophisticated policies to control messages in and out of the enterprise, in and out of the cloud. The good news is this technique, which you can read about in more details. There's many articles on this online over the last 10 years. It's a very hotly researched area of cryptography. The good news is this has all been standardized by the leading standards bodies worldwide. That's things like the IEEE that looks after the public key standards that you might be familiar with, like RSA and elliptic curve and so on, and also the industry standards like ANSI, ISO, and so forth. So I'll give you an illustration of a problem that IBE solved that is actually pretty hard to solve with traditional techniques. And this is a very simple business problem that exists in many organizations. So let's say I want to encrypt a message with some important attachments to a group of people in the organization. So I've got Alice here on the left to a number of Bobs represented by different colors here. So if I wanted to do this with traditional approaches, I'd probably have to do things like either, say with SMIME, encrypt to every single person uniquely, one at a time. So that adds overhead, it's complex, and it's actually getting messy, because now if I need to actually revoke access to that message, say I fire one of those individuals in the group for whatever reason, I have to then go in and revoke specific keys, and that gets really messy to manage over time and over lots of messages. And if I try to do this with, say, a separate system where I'm moving my messages somewhere else, I have to manage an access control list in addition to what I'm doing already in the enterprise. And I have to do this forever. So it gets very complicated and expensive to manage, and that's why, again, people haven't been using traditional approaches, particularly in the enterprise. So with identity-based encryption, what we can actually do is, instead of encrypting to each individual, we can simply encrypt to the group. And if I have one of those individuals that is fired from the organization or moves into another group, and I'm sure that those Star Trek fans will guess which one it's going to be, yes, I've moved the red individual from the group. We've removed that person from AD. That's all IT has to do, and the key requests to effectively decrypt that message are denied from there on. So it's very simple. We're not managing anything else but Active Directory groups in this particular case, and that solves the problem. Much simpler. So ultimately, identity-based encryption, I gave you one example of how easy this can actually be with this technology, but fundamentally it solves a gamut of difficult problems. Key management becomes very simple and straightforward because we never have to store or manage keys. Keys are dynamically generated on the fly, and we're not having to retain keys over time to manage things like revocation and so on, because that becomes very complicated and messy. You could end up with having to manage millions of keys, which nobody wants to do. Ultimately, this technology is implemented, as you'll see through the example use cases, is as easy as regular email as it gets. You've got the ability to hit a Send Secure button if you want to do this manually, as Michael pointed out. There's something like 39% of people actually doing that today. It can also be policy-based at the gateway, so you can trigger messages automatically so that you can have those 48% that want to do that already enabled. It can work with your e-discovery, your cloud, your smartphone applications, and so on. And so it's a very powerful approach that's designed for those large enterprise scenarios as well as small, sophisticated users that just works, and this is used by millions of users worldwide. So what this looks like in practice is a very lean infrastructure, because essentially there's no moving parts, there's no databases of keys, there's no databases of messages, and you can implement it either internally to support internal mobile users, desktop users, applications. It can work with your archive and e-discovery systems, so that even if you have a scenario where you need to get back to the original data, for instance, to decrypt a PST file in the event of an investigation internally, that's very easy and straightforward to do, but under policy control. It can also work at the gateway, so we could start there and then also add internal users later on. But of course, we've got the important recipients on the outside who can either use native applications, things like plugins to Outlook, or native mobile applications that work with the existing email flows and the existing inbox on the recipient side, or, more importantly, clientless options, so you don't even need any software to open, read, and reply to messages and handle attachments. Of course, this works both for the enterprise and in the cloud, and it can be delivered from the cloud itself. So you can either use this in hybrid ways or in on-premise or fully from the cloud. So for those internal users, that's 39% that like to do it manually, we have a very simple, elegant plugin to to Outlook into Office, and as well as to the Outlook application itself. And so ultimately what this effectively enables is completely transparent encryption and decryption for end users who are authenticated to access those messages and belong to those groups that are illustrated in Active Directory. And because we inherit what goes on within Active Directory, you're not having to manage extra control lists or rules. It's very simple to operate and manage, and basically it's plug and play with an enterprise Microsoft ecosystem. But if you want to share files, for instance, if you wanted to put a file up into Dropbox to share with somebody outside, might be, say, your legal firm, then you can also do that with the plugin as well. And that same simple key management enables that to be seamless, both for internal and external users. And of course, the smartphone has become the central tool for business these days. I don't know anybody that doesn't use a smartphone and uses email. And of course, with more and more users on smartphones and more demands from users to have seamless experiences, what we've done here is enabled this capability to add effectively this concept of a send secure from a mobile device, yet under policy control, so that you can have very clean and simple interactions with users. And the nice thing here is it's not creating another mailbox. It's not creating another application on the smartphone. It's using the existing inbox and the ability to open secure attachments, open messages, and have that completely policy controlled by the sender. And this can work with MDM solutions, because quite often people think that MDM it will solve the problem of email encryption. Well, it might help inside the enterprise, but remember that those messages are going to get forwarded and sent outside. And so you need to extend the controls to the message itself, which is exactly what this technology does. And for those that are not using any software on the receiving side, of course, and if you're sending to 1 million users, like a bank sending electronic statements or broker delivery statements from a trading company, then you want the users to be able to open the messages just using regular browsers, for instance. And the messages might arrive in their Gmail or their Yahoo or their Office 365 account, and they need to be able to be opened easily and quickly, yet still under policy control. So again, the capability is there, but it's not using webmail. We're not moving messages somewhere else. The recipient always has the content in their inbox. So if they go back to their smartphone and open it, it's the same kind of user experience. And when you start to get into sophisticated organizations that might have different lines of business, that have different needs, you've got the ability to also have customized scenarios for different branding for messages, for example, different ways to authenticate users. And so we have banks as customers that operate around the world that might even have different language needs in different regions and so on. And so this can be handled through independent tenants that provide a single platform to handle different duties and different business needs, because one size isn't always fits all, and you need that flexibility to meet the business goals when you're enabling strategic email encryption. So let's quickly look at 3 use cases. We've got customers around the world using this across a variety of industries, whether it's healthcare, retail, manufacturing, high-tech, banking, finance, and insurance. And I've picked a few here that are relevant, especially related to the cloud. So let's look at this company. It's a global payment company that handles vast quantities of credit card information and personal data, and it has moved to Office 365 like many organizations today. The challenge, of course, is that with highly sensitive data and the risks of blind subpoena on any cloud, reducing the subpoena to leak data, inadvertently, this organization wanted total control over the messages going up into the cloud, and to do this with encryption. And so they've used an on-premise solution for encryption, but with Exchange and their ecosystem and SharePoint for files hosted by Microsoft up in the Office 365 ecosystem. So in this case, you've got content that is effectively secured at the enterprise. We can secure it all the way to the business partners, which might be external legal counsel, might be consumers, it might be fraud investigators, and so on. And ultimately, we've got end-to-end protection with compatibility with, in this case, a Citrix MDM environment, DLP with content scanning and automation, electronic discovery and recovery with all sorts of different types of archive and recovery systems. And this is a high-scale global deployment, but this technology works equally for smaller businesses as well. And so here's an example of a smaller organization. It's a regional health network that actually has around 35,000 users in the system across a distributed medical network. So this network consists of a number of different entities. You've got the medical centers, the teaching hospitals, the administrations, and then various labs and so on. and you've got a very itinerant workforce with students coming on board and so on and so forth. And so they needed an approach to enable compliance to the various healthcare regulations for email encryption, but also have the ability to access messages anywhere across all of these different types of systems. And so in this particular scenario, you've got single sign-on, you've got a completely cloud-delivered solution, and a very simple and elegant user experience that enables compliance without friction. And last but not least, a very high-scale environment, again in healthcare, but again, this technology can be used across a variety of industries. In this particular case, you've got millions of people in a healthcare network. You've got patients, you've got doctors, dentists, labs, and so on at very high scale. And traditional approaches to email encryption just don't cut it when it comes to either ease of use or complexity, especially at these types of numbers. And of course, you need the ability to have that post-send management, so the ability from time to time to handle user errors, to do message revocation, for example, or to be able to ensure that after sending, recipients can't be inadvertently added in a reply. And so policy-based control within the sophisticated work environment was critical as a goal. And so this was actually a replacement. As Michael pointed out, in the next 12 months, many organizations are looking to replace their legacy email encryption solutions with usability limits. That was exactly the case here. And so the good news is that this is exactly the kind of environment that this technology excels at without having extra overhead. And so even though we're handling millions of users here, on average, there's about 10% of one person per data center to operate this, which is distinctly different to traditional approaches. So ultimately, we get to the point where the vision I painted of being able to secure email and files and attachments and interact seamlessly with end users around the world in and out of the cloud can be achieved without complexity. And I think the three use cases here illustrate exactly that point. It can be very low cost to operate, very simple to end users, and seamless, or as seamless as it can get compared to regular email. And can also work with those mobile devices that we love and constantly check every day. So that's it from me, and if there's more information that's required, you can contact us through these pages here. Back to the questions.
Well, thank you, Mark. We did get a couple questions. We'll dive right into those. First one, how does this approach compare to MDM solutions for encrypting email?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I noted that. So one of the things that people often think about with MDM is the fact that you have maybe encryption of messages in transit between your email client and then some kind of server or in a network operations center. And that may help with some internal protection, but only in the mobile. So if you've got that inbox and you're accessing it through, say, a web system like OA or through Outlook, it's done nothing to protect the data there. So it's only solving a very narrow part of the problem. And last of all, of course, messages don't stay in that container on the MDM system. They move out to recipients and partners. And so you need to think beyond the container and secure the messages themselves in and out of the enterprise. So MDM and email encryption work hand in hand. They're not competing interests in solving this problem.
We'll just have time for one more, and that one is this solution suitable for small businesses in addition to larger enterprises given in the example?
Yes. So I gave some good examples to illustrate the scale without the complexity here, but the same kind of benefits apply even to smaller businesses. So we offer this capability from the cloud. You can actually try it here in the link. And we have individual professionals using this, and even large organizations using the cloud. So you can have this for smaller businesses. It's very quick to deploy, very, very cost efficient. And once it's in, people actually like it. It enables them to do things in an SMB that might need to handle sophisticated content and regulated content. So it works well from the very large to the very small.
Well, we'll need to wrap up this session. So on behalf of cloudcomputingadmin.com, I want to thank you, Mark, and Michael, you as well. And thanks again to Voltage Security for their sponsorship of today's event. Don't forget to join us at the next breakout session using the separate link for that session, which is in your email confirmation. It's also available at the Twitter hashtag TGCloudCon. Thanks again for joining us for this session, and you may now disconnect, and we'll see you soon at the next session, which begins in about 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.